Hi, my name is Kelly O'Connor, and I'm talking about digitization projects, especially for historical collections and academic libraries. I started out with the framework of preservation strategies and wondering how librarians prioritize their materials for digitization, and ended up finding some gaps in the existing literature about how users can determine digitization priorities based on their interests and needs. So that's where the research is going to be leading me. So I hope you enjoy. So the primary goal of any preservation is continued access, and digitization can kind of neatly address those different aspects of what access means. So not only are we preserving copies of materials for future generations to use, but we're also providing immediate access to users and researchers who want to be able to view those materials. Microfilming is sort of falling by the wayside. While it's still a really, really good method for preserving documents in general, access is not quite as good with microfilming, and that was illustrated in the 1990s when it was used for preserving newspapers. User access was extremely limited. I've also included this quote from Paul Conway's Preservation in the Age of Google, which discusses how cultural heritage institutions have responded to new user expectations and how they're embracing those, technological opportunities that come along with digitization, whether that's getting materials to your users and researchers faster, or being able to preserve your fragile materials and limit the handling of them in general. So some of the problems that come along inherently with digitization projects is that it can take a lot of time, money, and staff expertise depending on what's being digitized. It's not realistic to assume that everything can be digitized in a short time frame, so prioritization is really an important part of strategic planning to make sure the materials that are digitized really count. Certain materials might not lend themselves well to all types of digitization projects. If materials are fragile, for example. Digital preservation is a continuing process, and files must be stored and maintained to ensure continued access to make sure that those files aren't corrupted or lost or have any number of problems occur. This quote from Alexandra Mills referencing new user expectations for academic special collections I thought was interesting, since it sort of illustrates how users and researchers today, especially those who might be less experienced, are kind of expecting to encounter the information that's available in historical collections. So user needs are really the driving force for preservation projects, but they're still rarely involved in the actual decision-making processes on a collection level basis. So with all that in mind, I'm keeping true to trying to answer questions about librarian perspectives on priorities. I am especially interested in seeing how academic libraries, specifically in California, are responding to those student researcher and faculty requests or expectations. Descriptive survey research methods seemed like the best way to do this, since having library staff report on how likely they are to use particular methods or how valuable they think certain methods might be for increasing user input seemed like the right way to go in this context. I mentioned here that Online Archives of California already has a great deal of digital collections, many of which come from academic libraries, but there are a lot of collections searchable through that database that have not yet been digitized and made available to the public. So that's sort of an illustration of how a researcher from outside of the library and information science discipline might be a little confused about, like, there being a record, but it's not visible online. You would have to go to the specific repository or library to actually view that file, which is not necessarily what most users are expecting in this day and age. So my main question was, how can academic libraries in California best prioritize the digitization of collection materials to optimize user experience and meet researcher needs? I wanted to know if there were any methods already being used by academic libraries and what those might be, whether those are, end user satisfaction surveys, feedback, or any sort of analysis of interest in specific collections, whatever that might be. In my literature review, I came across three major themes, the first being problems facing digitization projects in general. This question of whether digital surrogates for access should be made for short-term or whether preservation quality scans should be made from the outset. That's sort of a question that is common across several of these different articles here. The second major theme was the agreement that user-focused perspective should be a common goal when considering digitization and preservation. And then also there were some articles that talked about specific strategies or necessities for libraries to be able to meet those user expectations, and some of those use survey research either from users or librarians themselves to sort of gain a perspective on what is important for libraries to be preserving or digitizing and what they need to be able to do so. So the questionnaire would be submitted to archivists and librarians working with special collections at University of California libraries. I chose the option of a web-based survey, which would be made available for participants primarily because they're easy to distribute and collect, and also they allow participants to answer questions without time constraints and at their leisure, which would lead to hopefully more honest responses. The questionnaire should provide several different methods which may be used to categorize collections, like subject or overall type or genre. Responses would then be reviewed for completeness and reliability before compiling all those results into their appropriate categories. The survey research design, descriptive survey research, I chose because it's been used successfully in previous literature regarding the needs of libraries and users, and it's more likely that respondents will answer more honestly than in interviews and focus group. So to compile and analyze the data received from the questionnaires, responses would be grouped by the size of the library based on the special collections holdings, which would be included as part of the questionnaire before those results are analyzed. Responses would be graded on an interval scale and interpreted based on percentage of responses. Two major parts of the survey would include what methods have already been used by those libraries or librarians and how valuable or effective library staff consider these methods to be, either based on experience or opinion. There isn't too much to consider as far as ethics are concerned, since these are going to be adult professionals. Responses will be kept anonymous. Some of the limitations, though, are that this is a fairly specific group and doesn't include other types of cultural heritage institutions which would hold historical collections. So mostly a recap of some of the things that have already been mentioned so far, but I thought that including this quote by Harris about the idea of hidden collections sort of illustrated the sort of urgency that's facing special collections to increase access to the materials. User interest can be an important factor that hasn't really been explored yet in these types of decision-making processes. So essentially, most librarians already know that user-focused approaches are beneficial for collections. Formal methods for consulting researchers can help in the development of digitization projects and could be explored more. And also understanding what steps have already been taken in California libraries to involve users can help provide frameworks for libraries as a whole. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation.